Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am Sean. Today I'm doing a short review of Bird, Regeneration by Pat Barker. This is a book off the top 1000 list by James Mustich, 1000 books to read before you die. But I didn't know anything about the book otherwise, so I began reading it and I found out it is a World War I based anti-war book. World War I seems like kind of such an untapped subject. I mean, there's a ton of books on World War II. There's quite a lot of books about like the Vietnam War, but surprisingly not a whole ton of books, I think, about World War I, like fiction books. So I thought that was interesting. So I began reading it, not knowing anything about it, and basically after like the first 30-40 pages or so, I was like, it's just kind of okay. I mean, there's nothing good about it. I mean, it's just okay plot, okay storytelling, so on and so forth. There was nothing I thought that was particularly good about it in any way. So I was kind of struggling with the book. Basically, the book is about this guy who I just, found out later was an actual historical figure who was sentenced or whatever or sent to a kind of like a mental institution because basically he wrote this declaration opposing the war, saying that World War I was basically like an aimless war and he did not want to fight it anymore. So they sent him to this institution to kind of check to see like if he has a mental disability or something, or if he's trying to like just avoid the war. But I've just really made slow progress with the book, just reading like 5 pages here, 5 pages there, and just the book was failing to grab me at any moment, like for anything, the plot, storytelling, characters, characterization, whatever. Just nothing was really grabbing me. And I was struggling reading and liking the book, so I looked it up today to read more about it, and I found out the book was actually published in 1991. So when I was reading it, I was kind of just imagining this book was written like shortly after or even during World War I. But when I found out it was actually written in 1991 or published in 1991, that kind of killed the book for me in a way, because like the writing style itself just wasn't really appealing to me. But I could kind of see like if this was written during or like just after World War One, the writing style was different then. So, maybe I could give the writing a free pass for that. Well, the book is kind of dated, well, it's not dated. It was published in 1991. So the writing style of the book, that I was having difficulty with, not really getting into the writing style, not enjoying the writing style, I couldn't just say, oh, well, it's because it's an older book. It's not an older book. Then, in terms of it being an anti-war book, it was published like, almost 80 years after World War I. So how effective can an anti-war book be like 80 years after the war in question? I could understand if it's coming like during the war or like immediately after the war, or kind of just like maybe 10 years after the war, where, everyone kind of has a perception about the war, like, the Great War or whatever, like a real patriotic thing they did, like victory, they won this war. And, for 10 years later, someone looks back and reassesses the war. But this war was fought over 80 years ago when this book was published. So it's not like writing an anti-war World War I book, like criticizing World War I. It just doesn't have that same weight because, I mean, we know the faults in World War I. I mean, we know, like, the insanity that caused it, like just, this archduke gets shot, and so this country declares war on that country, and that country, because of an alliance, declares war on that country, and so they wind up fighting each other, and there's trench warfare, and just like, the sides, the armies just senselessly charging at each other across this no man's land and getting machine gunned down, and then the other side would charge across the field and they'd get machine gunned down, and just using mustard gas and all that stuff against each other. And it's just such a pointless war. So I mean, we know that. So it just doesn't really make sense to me that, like, why this would be an anti-war book published 80 years after the fact. I mean, we know the problems about World War I. So unless the book actually had something that was like a radical new way to look at the war, what's the purpose of this book? Another major thing about the book is about, this historical character's sort of like psychology behind World War I and like his development of his psychology kind of. And, basically what it's kind of describing is like the early days of like the medical field kind of learning about like shell shock, and now we know it is like PTSD. But back then, you know, they didn't really quite know what to make of it. So when like soldiers were freaking out on, you know, the front lines or whatever, or when veterans were like freaking out after the war, they would just think, you know, oh, maybe that's just cowardice, you know, they're shaking or whatever, or they're having nightmares, you know, so they would think, oh, you're a coward, you're trying to avoid your duty, you know, and all that. But afterwards, you know, we really learned about shell shock, so that kind of became in the like public vernacular or whatever. And now, of course, we know about PTSD. So we know about these things, whereas like in this time, you know, they didn't so much. So when like maybe a soldier was shaking, they'd think, oh, that's a coward, you know, we need to get rid of them, or we need to arrest them, or we need to shoot them, you know, they're not doing their duty. But now we kind of know what's going on. We know like the mental and physical effects that war has on people and that traumatic events has on people. So if this book was written around that time, like trying to draw awareness to this, like to try to tell people like, no, this is not cowardice. These are brave people who are having these emotional and physical reactions. They're brave people. They do heroic things. They're not cowards. You know, if this author was to publish this book around that time to try to bring awareness to this situation, to this very real thing, you know, PTSD basically as we know it now, I would understand that and I would respect that, you know, the author trying to bring awareness to it. But this is published 80 years after the fact, so we know about shell shock and we know about PTSD. So the whole idea of this book, like trying to bring awareness or whatever to like, you know, shell shock or PTSD, or to show the history of it, we know about the history of it. We know how like shell shock and, you know, PTSD, you know, the history of that, how we figured that stuff out and how it came to be an accepted term and like a real emotional and psychological reaction, not just cowardice. So ultimately, with the book being an anti-war piece or whatever, and also like trying to bring awareness or whatever, or show the psychology or history behind the psychology of all this, you know, like the early days of, you know, the medical field, like learning about shell shock, you know, it just loses its effect because we know about this. So it's not like bringing awareness to the situation. We know about shell shock. We know about PTSD. We know about the flaws in World War I. So for this author to do this book in the 1990s, it just doesn't really have that same effect to me. And again, with the writing style, I can't just say, oh, well, it's an older book, so, you know, I'll tolerate the older writing style. So all in all, the fact that this book was published in 1991 kind of just destroys any kind of like good qualities I could think the book would have, because it's not like a new innovative book. It's not bringing an awareness to anything we don't know about. It's not saying anything that we don't know about. So what is really the purpose of this book? I just don't really get that. Finally, what I will say is, in terms of the book being judged in terms of like historical fiction, I just don't think it does a good job, because I don't really like feel I relate with any of the characters. There's kind of, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 major-ish characters that have been introduced so far, and I just don't really feel that I really know or understand or like or care about any of them. And a lot of them are actually supposed to be historical figures, and I just don't feel like I have any kind of like fresh inside look or like new understanding or like the deeper understanding of what that person is thinking. I think the book would be far more interesting just written as like a straight history book, and it would be more informative and all that. Because what the book is almost written about is it's almost written like it's trying to persuade people in that time, and like the medical people in that time, trying to persuade them about like shell shock and PTSD and all that, instead of like trying to like tell modern readers about that, like to tell modern readers how this all came to be. Like, you know, this main character, I don't really know his name, Sigmund, I'll have to look it up. Siegfried Sassoon. So yeah, I'd never heard of that guy before. So I think it would be much more like oh, how do I say it? Educational. If this author wrote like a straight history book about World War One, specifically focusing on this topic. So like, Siegfried Sassoon, and just like talk about him and what role he had in, developing whatever he developed. Like if he had a part in like figuring out about shell shock or whatever, to just have like a biography about him and tell about, who he is. And, it says like, he's a noted poet. I'd never heard of him. And also, I don't like poetry. So how am I supposed to know about this guy? I don't know anything about him. And the way this book is written, I still feel I don't know anything about him. I would, however, know more about him if it was a history book where it said, Siegfried Sassoon was born in this time, this was his parent, this was his dad, this was his mother, this is the upbringing he had, this was like his backstory, like his family history, this is what he did in childhood, this is his education, this is the start of his poetry, and this is how he enlisted in the war, and this is like the first battle he fought, and this is like his first year in the war. And then like to go into the history of like his anti-war statement or whatever, his declaration, and then to show like, what happens after the war and all that, and, the future development of psychology, like learning about PTSD and all that. That would be much more interesting than basically the word garbage that this book is. So this book is just not interesting really in any way. It doesn't have like any kind of like illuminating anti-war pieces or whatever. It doesn't make me look at World War One in any different way. It doesn't make me look at like, the soldiers any differently. It doesn't make me look at like PTSD any differently. It doesn't educate me in any way. Whereas a straight, pure history book would do that. So I just don't really understand the point of the book. It's like historical fiction, but it's just not really interesting history the way it's presented. I don't feel I have any deeper understanding of the characters or the times. So ultimately, I just did not like this book at all. I won't say it's like badly written, but in terms of like what it's trying to achieve, make you like the characters, understand what they're thinking, understand the history of the time, understanding like psychology, I just don't feel I get that at all from this book. So this book doesn't really do anything for me whatsoever, whereas a straight, pure history book would. And it would be more interesting, it would be more entertaining, it would be more informational. It would even be more illuminating, like in terms of letting people know how all this psychology stuff developed, about like learning about shell shock and PTSD, the origins of that. So anyway, I did buy the whole trilogy. The whole trilogy is part of the top 1000 list. I only read like 40 pages of this book, and that's not much to judge it on. And I even think like the third book, I think it's The Ghost Road. Yeah, the third book is also like acclaimed as well. So it's not like this first book is considered like the best and then the series kind of tapers off. I think, critics or whatever do think, the other books, especially the last book, are maybe even better than this one. But still, I don't want to read, the first two books just to get to the third book. I'm not enjoying this book. I'm only 40 pages in and just not enjoying it whatsoever. So I don't want to wait till the third book. So I just don't care to read anymore. I don't care to read any more of the series. I understand it's a critically acclaimed book, but I'm just not enjoying it at all. So I'm going to DNF it and move on and hopefully find something else I do enjoy reading. So anyway, that is it. Thank you guys for watching. Have you read this book? Do you have any kind of different opinions than I do? Or if you've read any other like anti-war books, like which books would you recommend? Because I kind of like those kind of books. Since I'm on this topic, my favorite war book of all time would be Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried. I thought that's just a masterful book. It's a sort of like partly true, partly fictional account of the Vietnam War. The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I've reviewed it elsewhere on my channel. In fact, I will post that at the end of this video. That is one of my favorite books of all time. So anyway, that is it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to give a like and a subscribe. It really helps out the channel and then lets me know these videos are appreciated. Thank you guys for watching. See you next time. Bye.
2, 3, 4.